Rachel's world unravels when she discovers her husband Eric's shocking infidelity, leading to a toxic spiral of manipulation, betrayal, and violence. As Rachel struggles to protect herself and her best friend Kimberly, the situation escalates into a terrifying game of obsession and revenge, with Eric's sinister control extending beyond prison walls and the shocking involvement of a mysterious woman. The story explores the devastating impact of deceit and abuse, leaving viewers outraged and desperate to see justice served. It was a small, picturesque town in Ohio, a place where everyone seemed to know each other's business, but some secrets were buried just a little deeper. The year was 2019, and Rachel Carter was about to face the kind of heartbreak that changes lives forever. Rachel was a 34-year-old high school teacher. She seemed to have her life together, or at least, that's what everyone thought. She was kind, hardworking, and fiercely dedicated to her students. Married to Eric Carter, a 36-year-old contractor, Rachel believed she had found her happily ever after. They had been married for 8 years, and on the surface, things seemed pretty perfect. Rachel and Eric lived in a cozy suburban home, the kind with a neatly trimmed lawn and a porch swing that creaked just right in the evening breeze. They were the couple everyone looked up to, always smiling at barbecues, exchanging loving glances at the neighborhood block party. If you didn't know any better, you'd think they were straight out of a rom-com. But behind closed doors, cracks were starting to show. Rachel had noticed Eric working late more often than usual. At first, she brushed it off. He was a contractor, after all, and deadlines could be brutal. But lately, his excuses had grown thinner. He had been distant, distracted, and oddly protective of his phone. Rachel tried to ignore the growing knot in her stomach. She convinced herself she was being paranoid. After all, Eric had always been loyal, or so she thought. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that things weren't as they seemed. One Friday evening, Rachel decided to surprise Eric at his work site with his favorite takeout. She knew he had been stressed, and she hoped this little gesture would help rekindle their connection. As she drove to the site, she imagined the smile on his face when he saw her. But when she arrived, the construction site was eerily quiet. The heavy machinery was parked, and the lights were off. She checked her watch. It was only 7 p.m., far too early for Eric to have wrapped up for the night. Confused, she called his phone. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. Feeling uneasy, Rachel decided to head home. Maybe Eric had left work early and forgot to tell her it wouldn't be the first time. But when she pulled into their driveway, she noticed something strange. Eric's truck wasn't there. Rachel stepped inside, her heart pounding. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She set the takeout on the counter and glanced at the clock. 7:30 p.m. Where could he be? She curled up on the couch with a book. Though she couldn't focus on the words, minutes turned into hours, and when Eric finally walked through the door at 10 p.m., his excuse was as flimsy as tissue paper. "Sorry, babe," he said, avoiding her eyes. "The crew wanted to grab drinks after work. I lost track of time." Rachel forced a smile, but her gut told her something was off. Eric didn't smell like alcohol, and his shirt was too perfectly pressed for someone who'd supposedly been working all day. The following week, Rachel decided to test her instincts. She casually asked Eric about his work schedule, pretending to be interested in his projects. He answered her questions, but there was a hesitation in his voice that wasn't there before. She noticed him checking his phone more often, and once, she caught him smiling at a text, one he quickly deleted. Rachel decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. She waited until Eric was in the shower, then quickly grabbed his phone from the nightstand. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it. Thankfully, she knew his passcode. She scrolled through his messages, her heart sinking with every swipe. That's when she saw it. A text thread, with a name she didn't recognize. Kimberly. The messages were casual at first, talk of work and jokes about their coworkers. But as she scrolled further, the tone shifted. Flirty comments, late-night messages, and a photo of Kimberly in a dress that left little to the imagination. Rachel's stomach churned. She felt a wave of nausea as the realization hit her. Eric wasn't just working late. He had been seeing someone else. Rachel put the phone back on the nightstand and stepped into the bathroom, her mind racing. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. Her chest tightened, and tears pricked her eyes. But she didn't cry. Not yet. She decided to confront Eric the next day, but not before doing some research of her own. She looked up Kimberly online, piecing together a picture of the woman who had stolen her husband's attention. Kimberly was younger, prettier, and worked as a project manager for one of Eric's construction clients. That night, Rachel lay awake, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her. She replayed every moment in her mind, trying to pinpoint when things started to go wrong. Was it her? Was she not enough? The questions swirled in her head, but deep down, she knew the answers wouldn't change what had happened. As dawn broke, Rachel made a decision. She wasn't going to let this destroy her, not yet, anyway. If Eric wanted to lie, then two could play this game. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. Kimberly's social media profile was still open, and Rachel's eyes scanned every detail. The woman seemed perfect. Too perfect. Long, flowing blonde hair, flawless skin, and a smile that practically screamed confidence. She posted pictures of lavish dinners, weekend getaways, and gym selfies that made Rachel feel small. Rachel's chest tightened. She didn't look like that. She wasn't glamorous or exciting. She was practical, dependable. A woman who spent her weekends grading papers and organizing parent-teacher conferences. But then something caught her eye. Kimberly had posted a picture 2 days ago, at a steakhouse. The same steakhouse Rachel and Eric had gone to for their anniversary last year. The caption read, "Celebrating success with my favorite person. Cheers to new beginnings." Rachel's stomach dropped. The timestamp was the same night Eric claimed he was working late. Rachel snapped her laptop shut, her heart pounding. She felt like a fool, like the woman everyone whispers about, but no one warns. Her hands shook as she poured herself a glass of water, but it wasn't enough to calm her nerves. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She waited until Eric got home that evening. He came through the door smiling, acting as if nothing was wrong. But Rachel didn't smile back. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Eric's smile faded. "What's wrong?" Rachel folded her arms. "Who's Kimberly?" The color drained from his face, but he quickly recovered. "What Kimberly? She's just a project manager I work with." Rachel stepped closer. "Really? Because I saw the messages, the pictures, the steakhouse. Do you think I'm stupid, Eric?" He opened his mouth to speak, but said nothing. Instead, he looked away, running a hand through his hair. Rachel's voice cracked. "How long?" Eric finally met her eyes. "A few months." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Months. How had she not seen it sooner? She fought back tears, refusing to let him see her break. "I want the truth, Eric, all of it." He sighed, sitting down at the table. "It wasn't supposed to happen. She was there when I needed someone to talk to. Things at work were stressful, and you—" Rachel's eyes widened. "Don't you dare blame this on me." "I'm not blaming you, I felt like we were drifting apart." Rachel laughed bitterly. "Drifting apart. That's what you're going with instead of talking to me. You ran to her?" Eric didn't answer, and the silence was louder than any argument they could have had. Rachel shook her head. "You need to leave tonight." Eric's eyes softened. "Rachel, please." "No." She stepped back. "You made your choice. Now leave." Eric hesitated before finally walking toward the door. Rachel didn't watch him go. Instead, she sank into a chair, her whole body trembling. She thought the confrontation would make her feel better, stronger. But all it did was leave her feeling hollow. The next day, Rachel woke up to an empty house. Eric's things were gone, and for the first time in years, the silence felt suffocating. She tried to go about her day like normal, but everything felt off. Her students noticed too, asking if she was okay. She brushed them off with a forced smile, but inside, she was unraveling. Later that afternoon, Rachel decided to clear her head with a walk. She needed fresh air and space to think. But as she strolled through the park, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Eric. "Can we talk? Please, I'm sorry." Rachel stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She wanted to ignore it, but part of her still craved answers. Closure. Against her better judgment, she texted back. "Meet me at the coffee shop in an hour." When she arrived, Eric was already there. Sitting in the corner with 2 cups of coffee, Rachel sat down across from him. keeping her arms crossed. "What do you want?" "I just wanted to explain," he said softly. Rachel scoffed. "You explained enough last night." "I screwed up," Eric said. "But it wasn't about her. It was about me. I felt invisible, like I wasn't enough for you anymore." Rachel blinked. "So you cheated?" Eric's voice broke. "I'm not making excuses. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But I still love you, Rachel. I'll do anything to fix this." Rachel's heart twisted. Part of her wanted to believe him, to pretend this never happened, and go back to the life they had before. But the other part, the part that had seen the texts and the pictures, knew the damage was done. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said quietly. Eric reached across the table, but Rachel pulled away. "I need time," she added. Eric nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I'll give you space, but I'm not giving up on us." Rachel left the coffee shop feeling more confused than ever. She wanted to hate Eric, but a small part of her still loved him. That night, Rachel lay in bed, scrolling through Kimberly's profile again. She noticed a new post, a picture of Kimberly and Eric, laughing at a party. The caption read, "Couldn't have done it without you. Love you." Rachel's blood boiled. She threw her phone onto the bed and paced the room. Eric had lied again. He wasn't trying to fix things. He was still seeing her. Rachel wiped away angry tears and opened her laptop. She typed Kimberly's name into the search bar, clicking through articles and reviews about the company she worked for. That's when she found something interesting. An old article about Kimberly's promotion mentioned a scandal involving her previous boss, a married man who had been fired for inappropriate behavior. Rachel's heart raced. Was this a pattern? Did Kimberly have a habit of going after married men? Rachel grabbed her phone and took screenshots of everything. If Eric thought he could walk all over her, he was wrong. She was done being the victim. Before she went to bed, Rachel started typing a message, this time, not to Eric, but to Kimberly. "I know what you've been doing, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." She hit send, feeling a flicker of power for the first time in weeks. Rachel's hands trembled as she stared at her phone. The message to Kimberly sat in her sent folder, but there was no reply. Not yet. She kept refreshing the screen, half hoping for an immediate response, and half dreading what it might say. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the house made her jump. Her mind replayed her conversation with Eric and the images of him and Kimberly, over and over again, like a nightmare she couldn't escape. By morning, her phone buzzed. Rachel shot up, her heart pounding. It wasn't a text, though. It was a notification Kimberly had deleted her Instagram account. Rachel's stomach churned. Was it guilt or fear? Either way, it wasn't over. Later that afternoon, Rachel sat in her car outside Eric's office. She'd taken the day off, telling herself she needed time to process everything, but she was starting to feel like she'd entered stalker territory, but she needed to see it with her own eyes. Around 4:30, Eric walked out of the building. Alone, Rachel exhaled, almost relieved, until Kimberly appeared moments later. She was dressed in heels and a fitted dress, her hair perfectly styled as she joined Eric by his truck. Rachel leaned closer. They didn't look like co-workers. Eric brushed a strand of hair out of Kimberly's face, and then, there it was. He kissed her. Rachel's nails dug into the steering wheel. The image seared into her mind, confirming everything she had feared. It wasn't just an affair. It was real. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of the trance. It was Eric. "Eric, I need to see you tonight, please." Rachel wanted to throw her phone across the car. Instead, she typed back, "Rachel, fine, be home by 7. She had no idea what she was going to say, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to cry. By the time Eric walked through the door that evening, Rachel was ready. She sat at the kitchen table with the screenshots of Kimberly's profile pulled up on her laptop. "I saw you," she said, before he could even open his mouth. Eric froze. "What are you talking about?" Rachel spun the laptop around. The messages, the pictures. And today, at the office, I saw you kiss her." Eric's face went pale. "Rachel, I can explain." "Explain?" Her voice cracked. "You don't get to explain. You lied to me over and over again. I let you convince me that this was my fault, that I wasn't enough. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. But it wasn't me. It was you. Eric stepped closer, reaching out, but Rachel backed away. Don't, she said. You don't get to touch me. You don't get to make excuses. Eric's jaw tightened. You're not even listening. I told you. I was lonely. I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore. And Kimberly, she listened. She made me feel wanted. Rachel's eyes narrowed. So it's my fault again? No, Eric said quickly. That's not what I mean. I'm just trying to be honest with you. Rachel shook her head. No, you're trying to justify it, and I won't let you. Eric looked desperate. Rachel, please, I don't want to lose you. Rachel's voice dropped. You already have. Eric's face fell. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. You don't mean that. I do. Rachel stepped aside, motioning to the door. Get out. Eric hesitated, then turned and walked out without another word. Rachel sank into the chair, tears finally streaming down her face. She'd been strong in front of him, but now the weight of it all hit her. Later that night, Rachel's phone buzzed again. It was Kimberly this time. Kimberly, you don't scare me. You're just bitter because he doesn't love you anymore. Rachel's eyes burned. She was done playing nice. Rachel, we'll see who's scared when everyone knows the truth. Kimberly didn't reply. Instead, Rachel started forwarding the screenshots to Eric's family, co-workers, and even a few mutual friends. She wasn't proud of it, but she needed him to feel what she felt. Humiliated, betrayed, exposed. Within hours, the fallout began. Eric called her, furious, but she ignored it. Kimberly's name started trending in local gossip circles, and Rachel finally felt like she had taken back some control. But control is a dangerous thing to hold on to. The next day, Rachel woke up to pounding on her front door. When she opened it, Eric was there, angrier than she had ever seen him. What the hell did you do? He yelled. Rachel crossed her arms. I told the truth. You ruined me. No, Eric, you ruined yourself. He stepped closer, and for a moment, Rachel felt a flicker of fear. Eric had never hit her, but the way he looked at her now made her skin crawl. This isn't over, he said, his voice low. Rachel slammed the door and locked it. She backed away, her heart pounding. She thought she was done with Eric, but it turned out Eric wasn't done with her. Over the next week, Rachel noticed small things. Her car tires slashed, anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, and once, a shadowy figure outside her window. She couldn't prove it was Eric, but she didn't need to. One evening, as she was walking to her car, she saw him waiting. Eric, leave me alone. We need to talk. No, we don't. He grabbed her arm. You need to stop spreading lies about me. Rachel yanked her arm free. They're not lies. Eric's face twisted with rage, and before Rachel could react, he shoved her against the car. Rachel's breath caught as she struggled against him. Let me go. Just then, a voice shouted from across the parking lot. Hey, what's going on? Eric stepped back, his eyes darting to the approaching stranger before he took off. Rachel collapsed to the ground, shaking. She knew then, this wasn't over, not even close. Rachel sat on her couch, clutching a kitchen knife in one hand and her phone in the other. The lock on the front door was bolted, and all the curtains were drawn. She hadn't slept since Eric attacked her in the parking lot. Every creak, every shadow sent her heart racing. Eric was losing control, and Rachel knew it was only a matter of time before he tried something worse. She had already called the police and filed a restraining order, but paperwork didn't feel like much protection against a man who had nothing left to lose. Her phone buzzed, and she jumped. It was an unknown number. You can't hide from me. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She blocked the number and put the phone down, but the panic didn't fade. She needed help. Real help. She grabbed her laptop and started digging. If Eric thought he could intimidate her, he was wrong. Rachel wasn't just going to protect herself. She was going to end this once and for all. The next morning, Rachel drove to the local courthouse to follow up on the restraining order. She thought the process would make her feel safer, but the woman at the counter's words rattled her. It can take up to 48 hours to process. Rachel swallowed hard. 48 hours felt like a lifetime. As she walked back to her car, she spotted a black truck parked across the street. Her stomach flipped. It wasn't Eric's, but it looked like it. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder, but no one got out. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Rachel's paranoia only grew as the day went on. She installed security cameras around her house and checked the footage every few minutes, but all she saw was an empty street and the occasional neighbor walking their dog. That night, as Rachel poured herself a glass of wine, she spotted movement on the camera feed. A man stood at the edge of her yard, just outside the camera's motion sensor. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "There's someone outside my house," she whispered. The operator kept her calm, but by the time officers arrived, the man was gone. Rachel felt like she was losing her mind. Was it Eric or someone else? Either way, she knew she couldn't let her guard down. The next day, Rachel's world shattered again. She received an email from an anonymous account. Attached was a video. Security footage from a hotel lobby, It showed Eric and Kimberly entering together, laughing and holding hands. The timestamp was from the night he claimed to be working late. Rachel's hands shook as she watched it over and over, the betrayal hitting her all over again. But then, she noticed something strange. Kimberly wasn't smiling in the later frames. She looked tense, almost scared. Rachel paused the video, zooming in on Eric's hand. He was gripping Kimberly's arm, tight enough to leave bruises. Her stomach turned. Was Kimberly a victim too? Rachel didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right there. Suddenly, the messages, the photos, they all felt different. What if Kimberly hadn't been flaunting the affair? What if she'd been crying for help? Rachel debated whether to reach out to her, but before she could decide, her phone rang. It was Kimberly. "Rachel," her voice trembled. "I don't know who else to call. I think Eric's watching me." Rachel froze. "What do you mean?" "He's been following me, showing up at my apartment, calling me nonstop. I told him it's over, but he won't let it go." Rachel felt a strange mix of anger and fear. "You need to get out of there now." "I can't," Kimberly whispered. "He's outside." Rachel's heart raced. "Call the police." "I tried. They said the same thing they told you. Paperwork won't stop him." Rachel grabbed her keys. "I'm coming to get you." Kimberly hesitated. "Are you sure after everything We'll deal with that later. Right now, we need to get you somewhere safe." Rachel drove like her life depended on it. By the time she reached Kimberly's apartment, the other woman was waiting by the curb with a packed bag. Rachel barely had time to pull over before Kimberly jumped into the car. "Go," she urged, glancing nervously behind her. Rachel hit the gas, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. "Where do we go?" Kimberly asked. Rachel didn't know. Her house didn't feel safe anymore, but they couldn't keep driving forever. "We'll figure it out," Rachel said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Kimberly was shaking. "He's not going to stop, is he?" "No," Rachel admitted. "But neither are we." The two women spent the night at a motel, taking turns watching the window. Neither of them slept. By morning, Rachel had a plan. "We need proof," she said. Kimberly frowned. "Proof of what?" "That he's dangerous. Something we can take to the police so they'll actually do something." Kimberly hesitated. "What if he catches us?" "He won't," Rachel said, more confident than she felt. The plan was simple. Rachel and Kimberly would lure Eric to a public place, record his threats, and use the footage to press charges. It was risky, but it was their best shot. That afternoon, Kimberly texted Eric, asking him to meet her at a park. He responded immediately. "I knew you'd come around," he wrote. Rachel hid in the trees with a camera while Kimberly waited at the bench. When Eric arrived, his face lit up, but his smile quickly faded when Kimberly didn't stand to greet him. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting down. "I can't do this anymore," Kimberly said, her voice trembling. "It's over." Eric's expression darkened. "You don't get to decide that." Kimberly flinched, but she didn't back down. "Yes, I do." Eric grabbed her wrist. "You think you can just leave me after everything I've done for you?" Rachel's camera caught every word, every movement. "Let me go," Kimberly said, trying to pull away. Eric's grip tightened. "You're mine." Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears as she stepped out from the trees. "Let her go!" Eric's head snapped up. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Recording this," Rachel said, holding up the camera. Eric's eyes flashed with rage. He stood, but Kimberly broke free and ran toward Rachel. Eric lunged, but Rachel swung the camera, smashing it against his arm. "Run!" Rachel shouted, grabbing Kimberly's hand. They sprinted toward the parking lot, but Eric was right behind them. Rachel barely made it to the car before Eric slammed his fists against the window. "This isn't over!" he roared as Rachel peeled out of the lot. Kimberly sobbed in the passenger seat, and Rachel's hands shook as she drove. But they had the footage, and this time, Eric wouldn't walk away. Rachel's hands shook as she clutched the steering wheel, speeding away from the park. Kimberly was sobbing in the passenger seat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Did you get it?" Kimberly finally asked, her voice trembling. Rachel nodded, glancing at the camera that lay on the dashboard. The shattered lens made her stomach drop, but she quickly checked the memory card. "It's all here," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We have everything we need." But Eric wasn't the type to back down. Rachel knew that much, and judging by the look in his eyes as they sped away, he wasn't going to let this go without a fight. They pulled into the motel parking lot, their temporary safe haven, and locked the doors behind them. Kimberly sank onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. "I thought I could handle him," Kimberly whispered. "I thought if I just played along, he'd lose interest, but he's dangerous, Rachel. He's not going to stop until one of us is dead." Rachel's chest tightened. She'd felt that same fear before, but hearing it out loud made it even more real. "We're not going to let that happen," Rachel said firmly. "We're taking this to the police first thing in the morning." Kimberly nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. Later that night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the events in her head. Eric's grip on Kimberly's arm, his rage when he saw the camera, the way he pounded on the car window as they sped off. Her phone vibrated and she jumped. It was a text from Eric. "Eric, you think you're safe? You're not. You can't hide from me." Rachel's heart dropped. She didn't reply, but the fear gnawed at her. She needed to end this. Fast. The next morning, Rachel and Kimberly drove straight to the police station. The officer behind the desk took one look at the footage and immediately called his supervisor. "This is enough for a warrant," he said. "We'll bring him in." Relief washed over Rachel. Finally, they had the upper hand. But just as they were leaving the station, Rachel's phone buzzed again. It was a voicemail from an unknown number. She pressed play. A woman's voice, shaky and panicked, filled the speaker. "Rachel, it's me, Kimberly's sister. She's missing. I went to her apartment, and the door was wide open. There was blood on the floor. Please, call me." Rachel's stomach twisted into knots. She turned to Kimberly, who was pale and trembling. "We need to go," Rachel said. They raced back to Kimberly's apartment, but the scene was worse than they imagined. The living room was trashed, furniture overturned, glass shattered. Blood smeared the floor leading toward the bedroom. Rachel's knees weakened as she stepped inside. "Kimberly?" she called out, but the apartment was silent. Her phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. This time, it was Eric. "Miss me?" His voice was calm, almost mocking. "I told you this wasn't over. If you want to see her again, you'll come alone, and don't bother calling the cops. They won't get here in time." Rachel's breath hitched. Kimberly grabbed her arm. "You can't go," Kimberly said. "It's a trap." "I don't have a choice," Rachel replied. Kimberly's voice cracked. "Rachel, he'll kill you." Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she checked the voicemail again and traced the call's location, using an app she'd downloaded earlier. "An abandoned warehouse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kimberly tried to protest, but Rachel cut her off. "I need you to stay here. Call the police and tell them everything. I'll keep him talking until they show up." Kimberly's eyes filled with tears. "Promise me you'll come back." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." She didn't know if it was a promise she could keep. When Rachel pulled up to the warehouse, her palms were slick with sweat. The building loomed over her, its broken windows and rusted walls adding to the sense of dread that hung in the air. She stepped out of the car, clutching her phone and a small pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. The dim light from the cracked ceiling barely illuminated the rows of old machinery and wooden crates. "Eric?" Rachel called out. Her voice echoed. From the shadows, Eric emerged, dragging Kimberly by the arm. She was gagged, her wrists bound with rope. "Let her go," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. Eric smirked. "You think you're in charge here? You're not." Rachel took a step closer. "I have the footage. The police know everything. It's over, Eric." But Eric didn't flinch. "You think the cops can stop me? You're forgetting who I am. Rachel, I don't lose." He shoved Kimberly to the ground and pulled out a knife. Rachel's heart pounded. "Eric, stop! Or what?" He stepped closer, the knife glinting in the dim light. "You're not going to hurt me. You're too scared." Rachel clenched her fists. "Try me." Eric lunged. Rachel dodged, grabbing a metal rod from a nearby crate. She swung it, hitting Eric's arm and knocking the knife to the ground. He roared in pain and charged at her again, slamming her against the wall. The rod slipped from her grip as she struggled against him. Kimberly screamed through the gag, her eyes wide with terror. Rachel reached for the pocket knife in her pocket and slashed at Eric's arm, making him stumble back. But he didn't stop. He grabbed Rachel by the hair and threw her to the ground. She hit the concrete hard, pain shooting through her ribs. Eric loomed over her, his eyes wild. "You're done!" he snarled. Rachel spotted the metal rod and lunged for it, swinging it with everything she had. It connected with Eric's knee, and he collapsed, howling in pain. Kimberly scrambled to untie herself, freeing her wrists just as the sound of sirens filled the air. Eric tried to stand, but Rachel hit him again, knocking him out cold. When the police burst in, Rachel and Kimberly were shaking but alive. Eric was cuffed and dragged away, screaming threats as they hauled him out of the warehouse. Rachel sank to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. "It's over," Kimberly whispered, tears streaming down her face. Rachel nodded, but she wasn't sure she believed it. As the paramedics checked their injuries, Rachel felt a sense of relief mixed with lingering fear. Eric was gone, for now, but some scars don't heal easily. Rachel sat in the back of the ambulance, clutching the emergency blanket draped over her shoulders. Kimberly sat beside her, still trembling, her hands covered in dried blood from the ropes that had bound her wrists. Neither of them spoke. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the cracked windows of the abandoned warehouse, but the chaos outside felt distant. Officers moved in and out, collecting evidence and documenting the scene, while paramedics tended to Rachel's bruises and Kimberly's cuts. Eric was gone, hauled away in handcuffs, but Rachel couldn't shake the image of his wild eyes as he was dragged out of the building. Kimberly broke the silence first. "I thought he was going to kill us," she whispered. Rachel exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. "So did I." She wanted to believe it was over, but deep down, a sliver of doubt lingered. Eric's obsession had pushed him this far. What if prison wasn't enough to stop him? The officer who had taken their statements earlier approached. "We're pressing charges for assault, kidnapping, and attempted murder," he said. "With the evidence you gave us, he won't see the outside of a cell for a long time." Rachel nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. "Can we go now?" Kimberly asked. The officer hesitated. "You're free to leave, but I'd recommend staying somewhere secure tonight, just to be safe." Rachel looked at Kimberly, and they both knew there was no way they were going back to their apartments. They checked into a hotel under fake names, paying in cash. It felt dramatic, but neither of them was willing to take any chances. Later that night, Rachel lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She should have felt relief, victory, even, but all she felt was exhaustion. Her phone buzzed, and her heart jumped. It was a text, from Kimberly. "Kimberly, I can't sleep, are you awake?" Rachel replied immediately. "Rachel. Yeah, same here." A few seconds later, another message came through. "Kimberly, do you think he'll come after us again?" Rachel hesitated before typing her response. "Rachel, not if we make sure he doesn't have the chance." The next morning, Rachel called the detective in charge of Eric's case. "Has he been booked yet?" The detective sighed. "We ran into a complication. Eric's lawyer got him a bail hearing this afternoon. He could be out by tonight." Rachel's stomach dropped. "You can't be serious," she said. "Unfortunately, his lawyer is good. But don't worry. If he makes bail, we'll put a tail on him. He won't come near you." Rachel hung up without saying another word. She turned to Kimberly, who had been listening. "Bail? Kimberly's voice cracked. Rachel grabbed her keys. We're not waiting for the system to protect us. Kimberly hesitated. What are you doing? Finishing this. They drove straight to Eric's house. Rachel had a plan, but it was risky. If the system wasn't going to stop him, they'd have to take matters into their own hands. Eric's house was dark, and his car was still gone. Probably impounded after the arrest. Rachel broke in through the back door, which was barely hanging on its hinges after being forced open during the police raid. Kimberly followed close behind, her breath shallow. Are you sure about this? Rachel didn't answer. She was already searching through drawers, cabinets, anywhere Eric might have hidden something incriminating. And then she found it. A burner phone taped to the underside of his desk. Rachel flipped through the messages and froze. Photos, videos, evidence of Eric stalking not just Kimberly, but other women too. Kimberly looked over her shoulder and gasped. Oh my God. Rachel's hands trembled. We need to get this to the police, Kimberly said. Rachel nodded. But then she saw the final text message on the phone. Eric, bail's set be out tonight. Keep her quiet. Rachel's blood turned cold. He's coming back, she said. They barely made it out of the house before headlights lit up the driveway. It's him, Kimberly hissed. Rachel grabbed her hand, and they sprinted to the car, peeling out of the neighborhood before Eric even stepped inside. They drove straight to the police station, handing over the phone and the evidence it contained. This is enough to tie him to multiple cases, the detective said, flipping through the messages. He's not getting out of this. But Rachel wasn't ready to relax just yet. Can you guarantee he won't make bail? The detective hesitated. Not yet. Rachel's fists clenched. She and Kimberly returned to the hotel, but sleep was impossible. Every noise outside made Rachel jump, and Kimberly refused to leave Rachel's side. By morning, Rachel's phone rang again. It was the detective. Good news, he said. Eric's bail was denied. He's not going anywhere. Rachel finally let out the breath she'd been holding. She turned to Kimberly, tears in her eyes. It's over, Rachel said. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of the damage Eric had done. Kimberly looked at her with a weak smile. I don't know what I would have done without you. Rachel squeezed her hand. You don't have to face this alone anymore. The scars Eric left behind would take time to heal, but for the first time in weeks, Rachel felt hope. The two women hugged, and for the first time, Rachel allowed herself to believe that they were safe. Rachel sat by the hotel window, staring out at the dimly lit parking lot. The detective's words echoed in her mind. Eric's bail had been denied. He was behind bars, but why couldn't she shake the feeling that it wasn't over? Kimberly was asleep on the bed, her breathing finally steady after days of fear. Rachel envied her ability to let go, even for a moment. But Rachel's instincts wouldn't let her rest. She knew Eric too well. The man thrived on control, and there was no way he'd sit quietly while his world crumbled around him. Her phone vibrated, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was an unknown number. Rachel hesitated before answering. Hello? Silence, then breathing. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. Eric? A low chuckle came through the line. Miss me? Her stomach dropped. How are you calling me? You didn't really think this was over, did you? His voice was calm, but there was a sinister edge to it that made Rachel's skin crawl. You're in jail. For now, Eric said. But you've made a big mistake, Rachel. And when I get out, you're going to regret ever crossing me. The line went dead. Rachel stared at her phone, her hands trembling. She wanted to believe it was just an empty threat, but the confidence in his voice told her otherwise. Kimberly stirred, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. What's wrong? Rachel swallowed hard. He called me. Kimberly's eyes widened. What? How he's supposed to be locked up? Rachel quickly explained, her voice shaking. Kimberly jumped off the bed. We have to tell the police. We will, Rachel said, already dialing the detective's number. But the call went straight to voicemail. Rachel cursed under her breath. No answer. Kimberly grabbed her bag. We can't stay here if he's got people helping him. He'll find us. Rachel nodded. They packed their things in a hurry and left the hotel, checking out without looking back. Driving through the dark, Rachel tried to make sense of everything. Eric had connections. She knew that much. But who was helping him, and how far would they go? Kimberly's phone buzzed. She glanced down and turned pale. It's a text, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's from my number, but I didn't send it." Rachel's blood ran cold. "What does it say?" Kimberly handed her the phone. "I know where you are." Rachel's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel. "He's watching us." Kimberly's breathing grew shallow. "What do we do?" Rachel took a sharp turn onto a deserted road. "We stop running. We end this." They pulled into a rest stop and parked behind the building. Out of sight, Rachel took out the burner phone they'd grabbed from Eric's house. "I have an idea," she said. She texted the number Eric had used earlier, pretending to be someone from his inner circle. "She's at the motel alone. No cops." Rachel hit send and waited. Seconds felt like hours, but finally Eric replied, "Good. Keep her there. I'm on my way." Kimberly's eyes widened. "You're luring him out?" Rachel nodded. "If he thinks we're vulnerable, he'll show up, and this time, we'll be ready." They drove back to the motel, parking a few blocks away, and walking the rest of the distance. Rachel slipped into the room first, checking every corner before motioning Kimberly inside. Rachel positioned herself by the window, keeping an eye on the parking lot. Her grip tightened around the tire iron she'd grabbed from the trunk. Minutes passed. Then headlights appeared, crawling into the parking lot like a predator stalking its prey. "It's him," Rachel whispered. Kimberly froze. Eric stepped out of the car, dressed in dark clothes and moving with purpose. He glanced around before heading toward the motel door. Rachel's pulse raced. "Stay here." "No!" Kimberly grabbed her arm. "I'm not leaving you." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but stay behind me." Eric reached the door, and Rachel braced herself. The moment he opened it, Rachel swung the tire iron. It connected with his shoulder, knocking him back with a grunt. But Eric was fast. He lunged at her, grabbing the tire iron and twisting it out of her hands. Kimberly screamed, and Eric turned toward her. "Stay back," Rachel shouted, throwing herself at him. They crashed into the table, knocking over a lamp. Eric pinned Rachel down, his hand tightening around her throat. "You should have stayed out of this," he hissed. Rachel clawed at his face, but his grip didn't loosen. She felt her vision blurring, her strength fading. Then Kimberly screamed and smashed a vase over Eric's head. He staggered, giving Rachel just enough time to break free and grab the tire iron again. She swung it with everything she had, hitting him in the side of the head. Eric collapsed, unconscious. Rachel dropped the weapon, gasping for breath. Kimberly fell to her knees, shaking uncontrollably. "It's over," Rachel said, more to herself than anyone else. But before they could catch their breath, sirens filled the air. The police burst into the room moments later, guns drawn. Rachel and Kimberly raised their hands, but the officers quickly lowered their weapons after seeing Eric on the floor. "Are you two okay?" one of the officers asked. Rachel nodded, but Kimberly burst into tears. The officers cuffed Eric and dragged him out of the room. Rachel turned to Kimberly and pulled her into a hug. "We did it," she said softly. But even as the relief washed over her, Rachel couldn't help but wonder if it was truly over, or just the beginning of something even darker. Rachel sat on the edge of the motel bed, her knuckles still white from gripping the tire iron earlier. Eric was gone, hauled away in cuffs for the second time, but the adrenaline hadn't worn off. Her hands were shaking, her heartbeat still racing like she was trapped in the fight. Kimberly sat on the other bed, hugging her knees to her chest. Her eyes were red from crying, and her voice came out shaky. "I thought we were going to die." Rachel looked at her and forced a reassuring smile. "We didn't." "But what if he gets out again?" Kimberly's voice cracked. "What if this never ends?" Rachel stood and walked over, sitting beside her. "It's over this time. The police have enough evidence to bury him, and we're not running anymore." Kimberly nodded, but her fear still lingered in her eyes. Rachel wanted to believe her own words. She wanted to believe Eric wouldn't find a way to slip through the cracks again. But the truth was, she wasn't sure. The detective called later that night, confirming that Eric had been transferred to a high-security facility with no bail option this time. But even as Rachel hung up the phone, the uneasy feeling in her gut refused to go away. By morning, Rachel's worst fears were confirmed. Her phone buzzed, and when she looked at the screen, her stomach dropped. It was a text from an unknown number. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Rachel's hands shook as she showed the message to Kimberly. No, this can't be happening," Kimberly said, backing away. Rachel immediately called the detective, but he sounded just as rattled as she felt. "He's still locked up. There's no way he sent that." Then someone's helping him, Rachel snapped. The detective hesitated. We'll investigate, but until we figure this out, I need you both to stay somewhere safe and out of sight. Rachel hung up and started pacing. She felt trapped, like no matter where they ran, Eric's shadow was right behind them. Kimberly grabbed her arm. What do we do? Rachel clenched her jaw. We stop hiding. We end this. They left the motel and drove straight to the police station, demanding answers. The detective assured them again that Eric hadn't escaped, but Rachel wasn't buying it. Then who's doing this? She demanded. That's when the detective dropped the bombshell. We think Eric might have been working with someone, a woman. Rachel froze. A woman who? We're not sure yet, but we're looking into his visitor logs and call records. If he's got help, we'll find out who. Rachel exchanged a look with Kimberly. You don't think it's... Kimberly's face went pale. Jennifer. Rachel's blood ran cold. Jennifer was Eric's ex, the one who'd vanished from their lives without a trace years ago. But now it made sense. The obsession, the stalking, the access to Rachel and Kimberly's information. Rachel turned back to the detective. If it's her, you need to find her before she finishes what Eric started. The next few hours passed in a blur. Rachel and Kimberly were moved to a safe house under police protection. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe. Not yet. And she was right. Later that night, Rachel woke up to the sound of glass breaking. Kimberly! She hissed, shaking her awake. They grabbed the baseball bat the officers had left with them and crept toward the living room. A shadow moved past the window. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. Suddenly, the front door burst open, and Jennifer stepped inside. Her eyes were wild, and she was holding a knife. You ruined everything, she screamed. Rachel barely had time to react before Jennifer lunged. Rachel swung the bat, knocking Jennifer back, but she recovered quickly, slashing out with the knife and cutting Rachel's arm. Kimberly grabbed a lamp and smashed it over Jennifer's head, sending her crashing to the floor. Rachel kicked the knife away and pinned Jennifer down. You're done, Rachel shouted. Jennifer thrashed beneath her, screaming like a wild animal. The police arrived moments later, pulling Jennifer off the floor and dragging her away in cuffs. Rachel collapsed onto the couch, her entire body trembling. It's over, she whispered. Kimberly sat beside her, still shaking. Are you sure this time? Rachel didn't answer. She just closed her eyes and let the exhaustion take over. The next morning, the detective confirmed Jennifer's involvement. She'd been visiting Eric in prison, helping him orchestrate the attacks and stalking Rachel and Kimberly. Both Eric and Jennifer were facing charges that guaranteed they'd never get out again. Rachel and Kimberly finally felt the weight lift. But the scars, those would take longer to heal. Rachel looked at Kimberly later that day. We survived. Kimberly smiled weakly. Barely. Rachel squeezed her hand. But we did. And for the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to believe it. The morning after Jennifer's arrest, Rachel stood on the balcony of the safe house, staring out at the horizon. The sun was rising, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. It should have felt like a new beginning, a fresh start. But Rachel couldn't shake the weight pressing down on her chest. Inside, Kimberly was still asleep, exhausted from the chaos of the past few days. Rachel envied her ability to finally rest. But for Rachel, the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was Detective Harris. We confirmed Jennifer's connection to Eric, he said. She confessed to helping him track you down, sending those messages, and even breaking into your house. But here's the kicker. Eric had more than one accomplice. Rachel's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Jennifer was just the one pulling strings on the outside. Eric had help inside the prison too. A guard who smuggled in the phone he used to call you. We're looking into it, but there's no doubt. Eric had a network. Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. Is it over? It's over, the detective said. Eric's facing multiple charges, attempted murder, conspiracy, and stalking. Jennifer's looking at a similar sentence. They're both locked up, and this time, they won't be getting out. Rachel exhaled, the relief finally hitting her. Thank you. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew the scars of this ordeal wouldn't disappear overnight. Later that day, Rachel and Kimberly left the safe house. For the first time in weeks, they felt like they could breathe. They moved into a new apartment, one with better locks, security cameras, and a fresh coat of paint that symbolized a clean slate. But Rachel knew that healing wouldn't come from new walls or new furniture. It would take time, therapy, and the determination to reclaim the life Eric had tried to steal. Kimberly, on the other hand, was surprisingly resilient. She threw herself back into work, determined not to let fear define her. She started volunteering at a women's shelter, using her experience to help others escape abusive relationships. One afternoon, Rachel found Kimberly sitting on the couch, typing furiously on her laptop. "What are you doing?" Rachel asked. Kimberly grinned. "Writing my story. If it helps even one woman leave a dangerous relationship, then everything we went through will mean something." Rachel felt a swell of pride. "You're incredible, you know that?" Kimberly laughed. "I learned from the best." Months passed, and life began to feel normal again. Or at least as normal as it could after surviving a nightmare. Rachel started seeing someone new. A kind, patient man who didn't flinch when she told him about her past. For the first time in years, she felt safe, but Eric's shadow lingered. One night, Rachel woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. She dreamed about him, his voice, his threats, the way he looked at her like she was something he owned. She walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stared out the window. He wasn't coming back. He couldn't. But she still slept with a knife under her pillow, just in case. Kimberly's article went viral. Women from all over the country reached out, sharing their own stories of abuse and survival. Some even credited Kimberly's bravery for giving them the courage to leave toxic relationships. Rachel couldn't have been prouder. And then, one evening, a package arrived at their door. Rachel's stomach twisted as she picked it up. No return address. Kimberly stood behind her, her face pale. "Don't open it." Rachel hesitated, then tore the tape off and opened the box. Inside was a single item, a locket, the same one Eric had given her years ago when they first got engaged. Rachel's blood turned to ice. There was no note, no explanation, just the locket. Kimberly stepped back. "How did he—" Rachel slammed the box shut. "It's not him." "But what if—" "It's not him!" Rachel shouted, her voice cracking. She dropped the box into the trash and closed the lid. Rachel didn't know if it was Eric's doing or just a cruel prank from someone who'd heard their story. But she refused to let it break her. "Not this time." Rachel turned to Kimberly. "We're not running anymore." Kimberly nodded. No more running. And with that, they moved forward, scared but unbroken. Rachel started self-defense classes and even volunteered at Kimberly's shelter, teaching women how to protect themselves. She was done being a victim. Eric and Jennifer had taken so much from them, but they hadn't won. Rachel and Kimberly had survived, and they weren't looking back. Thank you so much for watching this story recap. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales like this one. And let us know in the comments, how would you have handled Rachel and Kimberly's situation? We'll see you next time with another thrilling story.